in North America and good morning in Asia and the Middle East. I'm Jennifer Gordon, Managing Editor and Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center. I am delighted to welcome you to the next 2 hours of live programming at the Atlantic Council Global Energy Forum. Thank you so much to John Defterios and to Etna Trainer for their discussion just now. And thank you, John, to you and to your excellent panelists for such a great discussion on the future of the transatlantic energy and climate relationship. Our next panel discussion will dive deeper into international relations, looking specifically at global trade. I am now delighted to introduce Ambassador Paula Dobriansky, Senior Fellow at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at the Harvard Kennedy School. For our next panel discussion, Global Trade and the Energy Transition. Paula, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Great to see you. And thanks to everyone who is joining us from around the world. I am very, very pleased to be moderating this discussion with our very esteemed panel, who I will be introducing in just a moment. And they're going to be discussing and diving deep into the intersection between the energy transition and also global trade. Let me remind all of you that this particular panel and event is on the record. And if you would like to participate in the conversation, please do submit your questions into the Q&A portal and we'll incorporate them into the discussion a little bit later on. Now, let me proceed forward, and I'd like to introduce our 4 very esteemed panelists, and I'm going to introduce them in the way in which I'm also going to pose questions to them. So let me begin up front. We're going to hear first from Dr. Jean-François Tremblay, who is the Deputy Minister of Natural Resources in Canada. And then second, we're going to go to Deborah Lehr, who's Vice Chairman and Executive Director of the Paulson Institute. Thirdly, we will then hear from David Livingston, who's a Senior Analyst with the Eurasia Group. And then we will hear from George Frampton, Senior Fellow, Global Energy Center of the Atlantic Council. So welcome to all of you. And let me go, if I may, to Dr. Tremblay first. You know, Doctor, as we know, the energy sector is highly trade exposed. And in order to attract investment and keep growing operations, employing people and investing in technology, we know that a competitive regulatory environment is really needed. So please share with us, what is Canada doing to bolster the competitiveness of the energy sector and also ensure that its own industry can attract investment, particularly during this very capital constrained time? And welcome to you, and look forward to hearing your response to this question.
Thank you, Ambassador, and I'm pleased to join you from Ottawa. And Ottawa is also the traditional territory of the and unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation. It's a very important question, especially in this time of transformation from an energy perspective. In Canada, we, as you know, we have a very strong energy sectors, and energy sectors that is actually a major export for us. It's more than 23% of our exportation that actually are the energy sector. We have oil, gas, we work on hydroelectricity, nuclear, biomass, name it, a lot of the energy sectors. And of course, the competitiveness of this energy sector, especially globally, is quite important in the current time. For us, I would say that there's we feel that the transformation is actually in the net zero economy, and the green energy is offering a lot of opportunities for us. On one side, we've got the feedstock and the natural resources that you need to produce those new sources of energy. And on the other side, we've got the workforce, we've got the expertise. For us, I think there's many initiatives that we're taking. I'm going to try to put them into 4 categories. First of all is making sure we've got the economic environment for investment. And that means for us having the banking system that is a good banking system. It means for us to have free trade agreements with, and we have actually free trade agreements with 2/3 of the global economy. And it's making sure that we've got all the sound economic and the corporate tax that are low, and we've got the lowest one in the G7. That's something we need to continue to have to make sure that we've got solid ground from an economic environment perspective. The other aspect is the regulatory regime. It's not anymore about economic development versus environment. It's about making sure that we have major projects that are grounded in good environmental practices. And we have just changed our regulatory regime. We've got now a new environmental assessment process for all major projects in the country that takes into account the needs from an environmental perspective, but also making sure that we better engage with local population, including indigenous people. And that's very important for us and for our competitiveness. It's good for the ESG, I would say, grade of our economy. A third element for us is to work on decarbonization. Even if you look at the trends on the net zero economy, it's clear that the fossil energy will continue to be an important and will continue to be significant for the next few decades for sure. And also we have to work on decarbonization. The oil sand industry has reduced by 30% the intensity of their GHG emission. They do invest in innovation and in clean tech. And as a government, we actually kind of push and pull to make sure that the system is in place to have a decarbonization of the energy. That includes new initiatives that we just launched actually on working precisely on methane emissions, but also on large emitter and making sure that we're reducing the decarbonization of our industry. Finally, I think a major point is we need to invest in the new energy. We can produce hydrogen, we can produce SMR, we have the expertise. We know that the energy market's going to be more complex, it's more diverse in terms of source of energy. We have launched a significant numbers of initiatives under our climate plan to make sure that actually we are increasing our capacity and our competitiveness in those areas.
All right, well, thank you. That's very comprehensive answer. And I will come back to you. You raised ESG. Let me come back to you, but on the next round. I want to go to, as I indicated, Deborah Lehr. And, the Paulson Institute certainly focuses a great deal on China. We know that China has pledged to reach carbon neutrality by 2060. Now, actually, is that a realistic goal? And what do you think are the challenges for China to be able to actually reach that? And also, what are going to be the ramifications of that in the context of trade?
Great. Thank you, Ambassador. It's a very broad question, but I think a really important one. Xi Jinping surprised a lot of people when he made the pledge last year for China to reach carbon neutrality by 2060. He did this in part as a foreign policy move and as part as China's attempt to take on climate as a major foreign policy issue, but also to set some very strict goals domestically within China and to really push the industry. It's hard to bet against China. They often come through, but it's going to have a significant impact at home, both socially, economically, as well as globally. To accomplish this, though, they're going to need really three main things: political will, technological change, and significant financial commitments. On the political will, they have to take on transformation of their state-owned enterprises, who are the major polluters within the economy. That's significant because they're the major employers, and they also, even though they're not the drivers of growth, they still represent a significant portion of China's economy. And so it's going to be very hard for them to transform them, but they've recognized for a long time it's a political challenge that they need to take on. One of the keys to that is to get their national carbon exchange up and fully functioning, which will be one way to use the markets to help drive down carbon. They also need to invest in technological change. They're creating a major technology backbone through Creation 5G and really promoting new technologies that will help in meeting those targets. New energy vehicles is just one example of the priority that they've put on these low carbon industries. And then financing. They estimate that it's going to cost about $1 trillion annually to meet their goals on climate change, but the Chinese government can only meet about 15% of that. And so they need to find ways to capture a lot of the private sector money that is out there that's available in China, but also available globally, to get it to invest in helping them to reach those goals. They need to show that not only can they create green infrastructure, but they can find ways to do it in a way that becomes attractive to the private sector and getting good returns. And so, as I said, it's a very ambitious goal. It will have an impact internationally because not only is China looking to make changes domestically, they're looking to both export some of these changes as well through then the technologies that they've invested in, whether it's new energy vehicles or even the standards that they're creating through the development of this national carbon exchange. And they're going to start to play a role in the drivers in pricing, like in renewable energy. So I don't bet against China. It's a long way to get there. They're just at the beginning of this, but it's going to be a very interesting process to watch.
You know, it's interesting because you said you don't bet against China, because I was going to ask you after you gave, well, if these are the types of things that they undertake, it almost sounded like you're betting a bit for. I mean, is the bottom line that you think they will achieve it if they undertake all these steps?
It's hard to say if they'll actually get there. I think the political challenges are so significant as well as, I mean, just some of the economic ones. But no matter what, they're moving in the right direction. And as the world's largest carbon emitter, we need them to move in that direction. And if with a new administration, it is an area that there could be cooperation. If you have the United States and China working together, it can make a significant difference in the world.
All right. Well, thank you for that. David, let's go to you. And being with the Eurasia Group, the Eurasia Group really looks at various issues strategically. So let's give you a strategic question. What do you see as the major developments around the globe that will in fact shape the very nexus of energy and trade in the near future? And in fact, is China one of the pieces? What about Canada? We're hearing about the Canadian policies. What is your perspective on this?
Thank you, Ambassador. It's a pleasure to be back at the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Forum, of course, virtually this year, but it's really a pleasure to be engaging with such esteemed other speakers on really such an important topic that's only going to increase in gravity, I think, over the rest of this year and ahead. You mentioned, China, so I'll start there. I mean, obviously, one of the important things that sometimes is self-evident, but I think is easy to lose grasp of when we talk about the ways that trade and the energy transition come together, is that we're increasingly talking about a less Western global landscape, at least when it comes to where the marginal demand growth is going to be, where the marginal investment is going to be, and where the marginal deployment of some of these new energy technologies is going to take place. To give a couple of examples, China, of course, has been the engine of growth over the past decade. It's invested more than $800 billion US into renewables since 2010 over the past decade. That's twice the amount of the United States. And even as China continues to be the engine of energy demand growth and investment, some of that is also going to increasingly diversify out to the rest of non-OECD Asia. So we already know that non-OECD Asia, emerging economies in Asia are seeing the fastest energy demand growth, and of course also concomitantly emissions growth of anywhere in the world. When the IFC tells us that emerging economies alone could invest more than $20 trillion in clean energy infrastructure through 2030, and that non-OECD Asia represents the largest chunk of that, it's an eye-opening number. And we're no longer talking about a subsector of the broader energy industry or a sort of niche sector here. Then the drivers of that growth are also diversifying as well. So for the first time last year, there were more than 20 countries that invested at least $2 billion in renewable energy. China and India together accounted for $60 billion, but you've got an increasing number of emerging economies that are diversifying that. The one other macro trend I note, and I'm sure we can dive deeper into some of the details of this as the conversation goes on, but the coronavirus crisis will have shaped some of these trends in material ways as well. One of them, of course, is just the significant fiscal impulse that we see globally. Well over $20 trillion of fiscal stimulus a significant amount of which in some economies has been earmarked for green spending, and earmarked in particular for export-oriented green manufacturing activity and green investment. At the same time that you're getting a monetary policy response over 2020 to the coronavirus crisis that's lowered interest rates, and all else being equal, has made investments in more capital intensive but low recurring cost renewable and clean energy investments more attractive. So all this is to say that you've got the fiscal impulse, kind of the monetary policy conditions, and then also coming out of the crisis, a particular crisis, which is sharpened minds in terms of some of the vulnerabilities of the global trading system and the global economy to critical supply chains for critical materials and products. There's also likely going to be an acceleration of some of the already extant trends in terms of industrial policy, and an increased focus on a larger state-directed role in investment in certain strategic industries going forward. So all that augurs for a larger role for government, strategic investments in some key sectors within the energy transition, and I'd say particularly batteries and electric vehicles for some reasons that we can explore further. And at the same time that you're going to see significant, marginal demand growth in some of these technologies in non-OECD Asia. And that sets up a global landscape that looks different from, even 12 years ago coming out of the global financial crisis.
Well, thank you. I mean, you really have touched upon a number of key issues that, boy, we could spend hours diving deep on. But I'm glad you've given that overview, and we will come back to a number of points that you have raised. Let me go to George now. George, today, thinking about the fact that we've had the inauguration of a new administration here in Washington, one of the first actions that President Biden has taken has been to put the United States back into the Paris Accords. And in this regard, let me bring in this issue of climate. Do you think that the harmonization of climate policies among trade partners can avoid a trade war? And, if so, what would this exactly look like? What does the potential friction essentially tell us about the kind of larger trade issues that new climate policies on both sides of the Atlantic will put into play? It's a key issue, and it would be great if you could address this one. You need to unmute yourself.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I'm very happy to be participating in this panel because I think that the remarkable increases in climate ambition that we're seeing around the world, beginning with the EU, and now, of course, the Obama administration coming back into this with a zero carbon, net carbon pledge, the Chinese, the Japanese, the Koreans. This new increase in climate ambition, I think, is going to raise a number of issues in the trade realm and with trade policy that are going to be very important, increasingly important, and attention to harmonizing trade policies to make trade a positive for climate rather than climate policy becoming a source of irritation in trade relations will be very important, something the Biden administration needs to address early and even peremptorily. Let me give you two quick examples. One is that because of the new emphasis on green COVID recovery plans, the EU countries, the US, and other developed countries are going to be, over the next year or 2 years, throwing enormous amounts of money into economic recovery, government spending that is going to be very carbon constrained. It's all aligned to be green and aimed at decarbonization. So those investment programs are going to have carbon limitations. They're going to be subsidies for low carbon development. They're going to be support tax benefits, regulations. Each of those programs is going to have elements that under traditional trade, WTO trade rules, other countries could possibly challenge. And instead of having a mutual war about this, you know, the notion of sitting down early and talking about how the major developed economies that are trade partners agree to sort of stand still and not get in the way of each other's COVID recovery, green COVID recovery programs could be very important. The other example is the rise of this peculiar animal called the border carbon adjustment. The new EU leadership recognizing that in order to increase their ambition by 2030 and 2050, Europe was going to have a very higher and steadily increasing carbon price, has led the EU to commit to develop and implement a border carbon adjustment of some kind, precise design to be determined this spring and coming summer, which has raised quite a lot of anxiety among particularly the US business community and certainly Republican House and Senate offices. And in fact, the Biden plan contemplates a border carbon adjustment of some kind as well, even though the purpose of that is to protect your domestic industry and protect against leakage. And if you don't have a price, there isn't any basis for a carbon border adjustment, but it's in the plan. So the potential for, as you said, a border carbon adjustment war, tension and friction there is something that really needs to be avoided. And there are ways to do that. The EU probably is leaning toward a less trade impacting form of leakage protection, which is to use their own cap and trade system for imports rather than have a tariff or a levy. But there are lots of ways that the US and Canada, which also has and is going to have a very high price on carbon, versus the United States, which right now doesn't have an identifiable high price on economy-wide carbon price. There are lots of ways to get together early on and begin to talk about how to develop other kinds of measures, standards, and arrangements that will guard against leakage and protect the competitiveness of each country's highly carbon intensive industries without having a trade war. So I think the importance here for the Biden administration is to address these issues early, knowing that an ounce of prevention is going to be much less expensive than a couple of pounds of cure down the road.
Right. All right. Well, thank you, George, very much. Let me go back. Let's do another round of questions with each of you. And I also am going to mix a couple of things up as we go along. But let me start with back again with you, Dr. Tremblay. And actually would welcome if you have any reaction to what George said, because I did notice as he was speaking, you seem to be shaking your head yes in agreement. But I also want to come back to what you teed up a little bit before, because you were talking about investors. And we know that investors, in fact, around the world are making clear choices by putting money in businesses, industries, and jurisdictions that in their own view are meaningfully combating climate change. So, and by the way, divesting from those that aren't. So you had mentioned earlier the increased focus on ESG from investors. So how is Canada's own energy sector responding to this shift in investment to keep the industry growing in the long term? So I'd welcome your response to that. And also if you have a reaction to what George had said. Dr.
Yeah, reaction to George. I totally agree with what George said. I reacted because this is a very important point for us. We're moving ahead with important carbon pricing. We're moving ahead with clean fuel standards now. It's important, and our economy are so integrated between Canada and US. We've got, I think, 70 pipelines crossing the border. We've got, I think it's more than 30 transmission lines. So at the end of the day, it's really important for our economy to have actually measures that are complementary, that are aligned that allowed the goods to move from one side to the other side, because our economies and our prosperity depends on this. So that's why I was reacting to George's comment on this, because I think it's particularly important for our country. On the ESG, I think for me it's an effort from the sectors, from the industry, but it's also an effort from the government. The reason why I think Canada is good and from an ESG perspective, first is because we're a great democracy. I'm sorry to say that, but it's true. We have a rule of law. We've got a system in place that is grounded, and we can ensure some certainty to the investors. And we also have practices that are well respected, and I think that's important. Our industry sectors and energy sectors has been quite active on the ESG. IBAs that have been signed for years in the energy sectors. As I mentioned before, a lot of measures in clean techs have been taken to reduce the emissions of the industry sector. But we need to do more, and we want to be better. And it is an area that we're working on. For me, there's two areas that are particularly important. The first one is, I think more and more, if you want to have a good ESG profile, you need to commit on the net zero economy. I think countries have to be clear on what is the directions, what are the expectations from a national perspective. The most recent climate change plan that we just launched in December is quite clear on this. We put in place a legislation, governments has to develop a plan, has to review the plan. As I mentioned before, we have now the clean fuel standards that are being developed. We increased the carbon pricing in Canada, and we are making a lot of significant investments in making sure that we are decarbonizing the industry and also investing in the new energy sources. So I think for me, that's a very important point because it sends a signal to the sectors on what exactly the sandbox looks like in the country and how they can participate to the development of this new economy. So that's the first point. The second other for me that is important is how do we improve diversity and inclusions in the energy sector? It is an area that is quite important. I think it's important for US too. How do we make sure that the population participate, the population benefit from the energy sectors, that they actually, a lot of the energy sectors in our countries are in small remote communities, close to small remote communities. So how do we make sure that they are included, they benefit from the economic perspective coming with the energy sectors? And that's an area that for us is very, very important. We have, as you probably know, legislation in front of Parliament for the implementation of the United Nations Indigenous Rights Declaration. So that's a very important element for us, the UN DRIP. We also work more with the industry on projects like, for example, Equal by 30, where we work with industry, making sure that they commit to gender equality in the industry by 2030. So for me, on the ESG side, we're doing great, but there's still things that needs to be done, that needs to be addressed, to make sure that we have an energy sectors that it's actually get the social acceptance and also at the same time benefit to all the different groups of the population in Canada.
Thank you for providing that perspective. That's very helpful, and it rounds out a bit of also more of what you said initially. Deborah, let's come back to you on China, because we really have a great resource in you and looking at where China is and how it fits into this picture. But what I want to also pose to you, David, I want you to take on, because I'm going to invoke the Eurasia Group. The Eurasia Group, in fact, had predicted that one of the top risks is that, quote, in 2021, climate will go from a playground of global cooperation to an arena of global competition, unquote. So first, starting with you, Deborah, how do you see that playing out exactly between the United States and China? And also, what are the ramifications more broadly for the rest of the world in this case?
Great. Thank you, Ambassador. And I know David will have a lot of insights into this as well, but I think the Eurasia Group is really onto something with this point. And I look at it in two ways. One, economically, Goldman Sachs has a study that they've done on the opportunities for investments and sales into the Chinese market for environmental goods and services. And they estimate it's about $1 trillion opportunity. That's hugely competitive for companies who are looking to sell and compete in China. And it's one of the ways clearly that China is going to try and grow its economy coming out of COVID. And so there's competition on the economic and trade front, but there's also going to be competition on the investment and financial front. As we look at what China has done in the context of energy vehicles, new energy vehicles, as I was mentioning earlier, they had decided that they could not compete in the traditional car market. And so they were going to leapfrog with the technologies. They created subsidies. For purchasing, they encouraged investment in these categories, and they now dominate the world in sales and are beginning to export these technologies overseas. Just recently, we've seen even Egypt this week announce a joint venture to manufacture new energy vehicles in Egypt. And so China is going to be setting the standards globally to the degree that they can in many of the clean technologies. And that's an area where they're going to be taking the United States head on. As we develop our own technologies, as the Biden administration looks at what our policies are going to be on exports of technologies to China, China is the largest market for our companies to commercialize those technologies. And if they don't have access to China, if we're not able to find ways to balance the limits and the rules around technology, is going to have an impact on our own domestic industry. So let me conclude there and let David add to that. I'm sure he has some terrific thoughts.
All right.
Well, I'm lucky I get to go second because Deborah just made a flurry of terrific points, much more articulately than I would have. I would just add a couple of things. If you're looking for anecdotal evidence of this as well, just look at what a core part of the recently negotiated, comprehensive agreement on investment between the EU and China, that clean energy and the electric vehicle sector played in those negotiations and in the final, list of negotiated concessions on market access, et cetera. One of the major objectives on the Chinese side was to increase market access to the renewable sector in Europe, which they were able to do, albeit with specific caps on some of that investment on a member state basis in the EU. Going the other direction, one of the primary objectives on the part of the EU that was successful was in gaining market access to the electric vehicle market and to new energy vehicle manufacturing in China. Another thing worth keeping in mind here is that those are competitive advantages that have been negotiated in the sense that investment in manufacturing is not covered by most favored nation or MFN provisions at the WTO level. And so, those reductions in tariffs or market access gains are to be, kind of completely captured by the negotiating party, in this case, the EU. And so I think that's just, an anecdotal piece of evidence in terms of the centrality of some of these sectors in China, and the fact that they're kind of core to future competitiveness concerns. Electric vehicles writ large, I'll just highlight, it's not hard to kind of do it back of the envelope math to understand why this is so important. There are around 10 million electric vehicles globally today. There are around 1 billion, more than 1 billion internal combustion engine passenger vehicles today. That means that if you're looking to replace the fleet entirely, you're looking at doing a 10x, 2 times over of the current amount of electric vehicles deployed. This may sound kind of outlandish, but it's actually feasible considering where battery costs are going. The cost of an electric vehicle battery pack has gone from, dropped in price 88% between 2010 and 2020 over the past decade. Bloomberg estimates that cost will drop below $100 per kilowatt hour in 2024. And that is where you start to get to the range of cost competitiveness without subsidies with a internal combustion engine vehicle. And again, when you have low interest rates, abundant consumer credit, and a lot of central banks around the world looking to kind of flatten out the yield, flatten out the curve, so that they keep credit on the back end of that curve cheap for a long time. It creates a set of circumstances in which electric vehicles could be very attractive to the individual household very quickly. Now, what this means is that some of these vehicles will piggyback on existing vehicle supply chains, but many new value chains will need to be created. USMCA, for example, increased the amount of local content that's required, North American content that's required in the manufacture of new energy vehicles over what was in NAFTA. And that's going to require a huge amount of realignment of existing value chains in the electric vehicle sector, to the point where I think it's no longer a question of if, but when North America will develop a massive battery manufacturing and electric vehicle supply chain compared to what they have today. The real question is how that's going to be distributed across Canada, the United States, and Mexico, and how that North American platform in new energy vehicles is going to compare to the EU platform that's being readily invested in by EU officials and industry, as well as the Chinese platform, which we know already has a head start and is deploying tens of gigafactories every year when the United States is struggling, has struggled, particularly kind of over the past several years, to deploy even a handful of gigafactories, battery gigafactories per year. So all this adds up together to be one of the most, kind of predictable, economic transitions and energy technology and economic opportunities in the history of economic transitions, and one that countries are going to readily lean into.
Thank you, David. Wow, I'm going to say you really dove deep on that one. George, I have to ask you this because you are very focused, of course, on, the Biden administration. You're focused on the EU. What do you think about what David just said? Are you in agreement with that? Is that how you see, he really cast this as a rather significant issue that's before us? Is that your perspective?
Well, I think that the EU agreement with China is and the descriptions that Deborah and David gave to some of the aspects of that, that's a perfect example of how trade policy can be used to foster a global climate ambition and improve everybody's climate program instead of causing each side's trading partner's climate program to be impeded or slowed down. And I think, but that's true also of not just of China, but indeed I think that people coming into the Biden administration, and certainly both the EU and the UK climate officials, and the UK will host the G7 meeting as well as the Glasgow COP, are looking immediately to this climate summit that President Biden said he's going to put together in his first 100 days, if that comes about. If not, the G7 meeting in London, to begin to focus specifically on how these kinds of investment agreements and investment arrangements and commitments that the G7 can make can actually help with the trade situation and increase everybody's investment. The big emphasis on finance. When you come back to the sort of EU, US, Canadian situation, which the minister referred to, I think what's happening between the US and Canada potentially could happen even more is a good example of how, again, trade can become positive, and there's a way to harmonize and align climate programs with Canada at a $30, $40 carbon price and going up to over $100 now projected by in the next decade. There isn't any major trading partner of the United States that has a better reason to put a trade, border carbon adjustment on its imports from the United States than Canada. And yet, if you talk to business people in Canada, and I can characterize the government. So perhaps the minister doesn't have to say this, but there's a tremendous reluctance to do that because the Canadians realize that the benefits of a border carbon adjustment for their industry are probably far less than the trade disruption that it would cause in overall trade relationships. So they're not eager to do that. And what we're trying to do with Canada is to do a harmonization of climate programs in a different way so they can be more equivalent. Canada's adopted California's low carbon fuel system. Canada's moving on zero emission vehicles. So in the electrification, fleet electrification area, which is our largest sector of emissions, policies can be complementary, and so there isn't the price difference can be viewed as something that doesn't really provide for leakage of emissions. So what we need to do, are doing, and need to do more. Canada is a pretty good model also for how trade can be used to benefit everybody's climate program rather than be disruptive.
Thank you, George. I do have some questions from our viewers around the world, but I do want to give you, Dr. Tremblay, just a chance. Do you want to comment on what you heard from George? He certainly invoked Canada a number of times in his perspective. Would you like to comment at this moment?
I owe him money every time he pronounces the word Canada, so that's going to cost me a lot tonight. No, I'm teasing. I want to come back maybe on also on what David said about the battery value chain. I think it's a very good point. I think we should not underestimate the change of paradigm in this economic shift. It's a very significant one. And every time we have a shift like that, there's new natural resources that are used, a new source of energy. It's not the first time it happened in human history. And I think it's going to demand, and it's going to ask North America to really work together on developing this value chain. And that's going to be a very important reason to be good partners over the next few years. I agree, of course, with George on the importance of harmonization. You want, as I mentioned before, the flow of goods between the two countries to be on equal playing field. You want to make sure that actually we have an integrated economy, and that's even better because that creates certainty for the industry that actually it's not just developing on one side, as you know, and exporting on the other side. As we know in the other sectors, the pieces actually are moving the border of many times sometimes. So it's very integrated, and that's why it's so important to do it.
Let me, if I can, go with one of the questions. We have several questions I do want to get in from our viewers. One was, and it's very much related to this conversation, the question is, what possibilities exist for the US, EU, China trilateral relationship, particularly under the new Biden administration? Deborah, do you mind if I go to you on that one? Would you be willing to take it on?
Sure. The Biden administration has stated that before they roll out their new China policy, they want to seek to rebuild and coordinate with their allies on their China policy. I think that's obviously an excellent place to start, but I think that the chances of doing that in a timely way are going to be very difficult. And I think that the success is going to be mixed. In areas where I think our allies will see it in their interest to coordinate with us, they will. But in areas where they're going to pursue their own self-interest, as always, but as we saw with the China-EU agreement, they're going to move forward. And they're not going to lose sight of the fact in 4 years, we could be facing a different kind of administration again. And so taking on China is the fastest growing economy, major economy in the world right now. Many other countries are still struggling to come out of their post-COVID recession. And there are only two real options for them to look to do that, the United States or China. And so they're going to be reluctant to take on China in any significant way. So I think if we put the trade issues aside, finding areas of common interest are going to be very important for the overall relationship. Clearly, climate change is one of those. And I do think there's the potential of coordination between not just the EU and the United States and China, but many of our allies to coordinate and see if we can't come forward with new policies. And I think the big issue in all of this is going to be financing and how we coordinate on the whole green finance issues, because ultimately Paris is only as good as our ability to implement. And for most countries, they don't have the financial wherewithal to do that.
Would any of you like to jump in on this and add anything further on this particular question? David,
I'll just to echo, to amplify and echo again what Deborah said, and just add that I think a really interesting catalyst for exploring some of those green finance discussions in interesting ways is probably, again, the emergence from the some of the debt distress and some of the debt loads that several emerging economies are going to have coming out of the coronavirus crisis. You know, for those who've been tracking this, they're probably aware that there's still a search for alignment, an evasive search for alignment, kind of between some of the G20 and Western Financial Paris Club, you know, debt relief initiatives that have gone on, and the role that, you know, some expect China to play as a major lender, both official and unofficial lender to, you know, to many of these economies through Belt and Road related financing, but also otherwise. And I think, you know, bringing in an energy transition, a climate resilience component to some of those discussions about trying to find common ground between some of the traditional, you know, lender entities in the form of the Paris Club and, you know, and of course, private creditors, et cetera, and China, on the other hand, you know, can be, if done right, a very interesting additive component that can be a win-win all around.
George, do you mind if I come to you on another question that has come in from our viewers? It's uppermost in particularly a lot of Europeans' minds. How does the post-Brexit UK-US trade relationship fit into all of this? Do you have a view on that you'd like to share?
Well, I know that the British and EU climate people have continued to work together through all this. And I'm not sure that it really, in the long run, will have an enormous amount of impact. It may make, I mean, if you look at the China on the one hand as Deborah said, one of the two sources of financing that countries that don't have the resources to do a meaningful energy transition right now will look to. The other two are really the UK and the US. So it's the UK now and the US that have the resources in the rest of the developed world, the financial resources, the markets, the access. So in some ways it may enhance slightly the ability of the UK. I don't want to be very supportive of the Brexit thesis, but it may be somewhat, maybe a push to the UK to become more active in climate finance with the US. And certainly Boris Johnson and the government are very conscious of the fact that, you know, this is going to be in some ways more important year than the Paris conference year. They are hosting it. They will get the credit or the blame to some significant extent of its success or failure. And I think it puts a heavy stress on them. So it's not inconceivable to me that this will enhance the appetite of Britain to become more of a leader rather than just be part of the pack of the EU, but to show some more leadership. They have to show, you know, they'll have to show some leadership because this is the first thing that the UK does that's this visible in the world as a whole on their own. And if they can't take leadership, if they fall behind, that makes Brexit look like a much bigger mistake. So there's a lot at stake for the British in the upcoming year on climate. And we'll see if that operates to the advantage of the climate finance itself.
Right. Do any of the other panelists, do any of you have a view on this that you want to share? All right, let me move on. We have another question, which is, a successful trade agreement would typically increase emissions output. Can trade policy truly be climate neutral? Who wants to take that one on? Can a trade policy be truly climate neutral? David? I don't know. I see you sort of, or Dr. Tremblay, either way. David, you want to go first?
It will have to. That's for sure.
I'll just say that I think it's it's a complex question. It's a complex topic, and so there's not going to be an easy answer. It's a complex answer as well. It depends on how you're framing carbon neutrality, spatially as well as temporally, and I think that's really important because we're oftentimes going to generate emissions to on net reduce emissions later on in time. That's also, of course, going to be done on a geographic basis as well. So that has to, we have to take account of that. I think the objective here should be to, in the interim, try to reduce the carbon intensity of trade to wherever we can and to the degree we can. Because of course, that's going to, especially coming out of a pandemic and a very challenging set of economic headwinds, reducing that carbon intensity actually has the potential to unlock more efficient economic growth and more productivity. In a way where just focusing on the absolute bottom line emissions in trade doesn't necessarily lead to that same outcome.
Well, let me just say that as a matter of pure policy, the question is absolutely correct because the purpose of a trade agreement is to increase output, right? Just like the purpose of the COVID recovery investments that countries all over the world are be making is to increase output. But the trick, of course, is to make sure that the way in which that plan is designed and the way in which the output is produced is lower carbon output. So can trade agreements do that? They certainly can if the parties have that as a critical objective and follow through with it.
Deborah, did you, I don't know, I saw you motion at least or acknowledge that yes. Do you want to make a quick comment on this or no? It seemed like you were in agreement with what George just said.
Oh, yes, I was in agreement. I was thinking it was a very clever way to think about the issue. So, yeah. But that seems to be part of, I think, as we look at expanding the issues around which we negotiate. I know with the Canadians, you've been very creative in looking at diversity and including that in trade agreements. Clearly, this is going to be a critical part of any trade agreement that we look at going forward.
Okay, and Dr. Tremblay, we have 5 minutes left. So I'm going to do a quick round robin with each of you, but let me begin with you again. If you, of course, have a comment on that last question, go forth. But I do want to ask you, because now we have the Biden administration, just how do you see in terms of Canada's energy sector, what will be maybe opportunities or changes, shifts that you envision? But please, if you'll give a brief response to that so we can do the round robin and get everybody in.
Yeah, on the first one, I just coming back on the trade, I think it's we have to go to a situation where it's not between economic development and trade versus emission and reduction of emission. It's finding a way to have economic development that actually include this. So how do we use the trade agreements to go there? I think David is right that for a certain period of time, it may be the intensity, but at some point it's going to have to be going in that directions for sure. I think it offers for us the relationship with the United States, with the new administration, offer a lot of opportunities. I mean, we're going to Paris together. We're going to Paris on the same side with the same clear objective, which I think is key for two nations. It gave us an opportunity to actually start working on how we get there and how we get to the net zero economy. What does mean the development of this of the supply chain from the critical mineral perspective to get the batteries and the technology and the natural resources and the tools that we need for the new economy. So I think we are poised to actually succeed together on this. And that's what I believe. Our relationship is a relationship of friendships that has been there for decades and will continue. And now we have a partner, and it's been a long time since the last time we had a partner actually in US. It's totally aligned in terms of climate change. And I think in terms also on green energy. And we also share the same kind of objective of making sure that the population, the diversity of the population is well respected, making sure that we're inclusive in our policy, making sure that this development is not against such certain group of the population. So there's actually a savoir-faire, as we say in French, it is a non-American one that I think we're going to be able to work on.
Thank you, Dr. Tremblay. Forgive me for interrupting, but we only have about 2.5 minutes left. So I'm going to go to Deborah. Very fast question, 30 seconds, really. So what's the opportunity with China, given the new phase we're going into that you see?
I would say the opportunity with China is not only working with them at home, but abroad, and financing can make a big difference. And the Chinese just released a study looking at suggesting that they give an environmental ranking to all Belt and Road projects. And while they can't change the policies that those governments make, they can change how they lend to those projects. And if they can change those standards, they can make a huge difference in what happens along the Belt and Road. And that's, I think, a potential area of cooperation.
And then David, and then George. Just I'll let you take it in whatever direction you want, but just to be brief, with the new administration and relevant to this topic, what opportunity do you see or challenge? David, really 30 seconds.
Very quickly, I'll just say one thing I'm very excited about, that I think the Biden campaign and now the Biden administration has emphasized repeatedly is a need to invest first at home before starting to engage again and reconsider how the trade system needs to evolve to accommodate climate change. And I think that's important to be sustainable from a political economy perspective, so that we create these growth industries at home in the clean energy future. And then we can engage globally on how we grow those together.
All right, George.
Just a footnote to the trade discussion. I think there are tremendous opportunities if we view North America as a whole in energy cooperation and climate. And certainly the Biden and Trudeau administrations will be very, very cooperative. But there were certainly those Canadians and Americans who thought that Obama was not that interested in really North American cooperation. Bringing the Mexicans along on the climate agenda will be hard, but there are tremendous opportunities here looking at North America as more of an entity.
All right. Well, look, first, let me say to Dr. Jean-François Tremblay, Deborah Lehr, David Livingston, and George Frampton. All of you have been absolutely terrific and energetic, given the time in which we're operating, at least in Eastern Standard Time. And just thank you. You've been an outstanding, outstanding panel. And now it really gives me a great pleasure to pass it back to Jennifer, who is going to take on the next panel. Jennifer, back over to you, and thank you. And thanks to our panelists again.